January 17, 1945, Luzon Island, Philippines. The Agno River ran cold that morning, swollen with monsoon rain. Beneath a canopy of smoke and mist, the water moved fast, brown and churning, dragging debris from shattered bridges upstream. On the eastern bank, among the shattered remnants of what had once been a thriving sugarcane plantation, Lieutenant Colonel Hiroshi Takamura pressed his field glasses to his eyes. His fingers trembled, though not from the damp. He had been awake for 37 hours. The air smelled of burnt diesel, wet earth, and something sweeter decay perhaps, or the residue of napalm from an airstrike 2 days prior. He had commanded armor in Manchuria. He had seen Soviet T-34s burn on the frozen steppes. He had studied German panzer tactics in manuals smuggled through neutral ports. But what he saw now, emerging from the smoke on the opposite shore, defied every principle he had learned. American tanks were entering the river, not fording at a shallow crossing, not waiting for engineers to construct a pontoon bridge. They were simply driving into the current, turrets rotating smoothly as they descended into the brown water. And then, impossible, unthinkable, they fired. The muzzle flash lit the mist. The crack of the 75mm gun echoed across the water. The shell struck a Japanese Type 97 Chiha tank concealed in the tree line 300 meters behind Takamura's position. The explosion sent a fountain of red dirt and twisted steel into the gray sky. The American tank was still half submerged. Its hull vanished beneath the surface. Only the turret remained visible, a steel island moving through the flood, its barrel smoking, its commander's hatch open to the rain. Takamura lowered his glasses. His mouth had gone dry. He turned to his radio man, a boy of 19 whose face had not yet learned to hide fear. "Tell headquarters," Takamura said quietly, his voice almost lost beneath the rumble of distant artillery, "that the Americans have brought demons across the water." This was not hyperbole. This was not the exaggeration of a desperate man. In the rigid calculus of Imperial Japanese armored doctrine, what Takamura witnessed was theoretically impossible. Tanks were land weapons. Water was their executioner. A river deeper than the height of an engine's air intake meant death-flooded cylinders, drowned crews, steel coffins sinking into mud. The manuals were explicit. The training was unambiguous. Rivers were barriers that required bridging equipment, air superiority, and hours of vulnerable preparation. Yet the Americans crossed as if the water itself had bent to their will, and they killed while crossing. The weapon Takamura could not name, the machine that shattered his understanding of armored warfare, was the M4A3EH Sherman, fitted with a deep-weighting kit and equipped with doctrine so audacious it bordered on madness. But madness, Takamura would later write in a journal recovered from his body 3 weeks after the battle, is indistinguishable from abundance when your enemy possesses both. To understand the shock that paralyzed Japanese commanders along the rivers of Luzon, along the Roe in Germany, along a dozen waterways across the collapsing empire of the rising sun, one must first grasp what they expected. The Japanese Empire, for all its early victories, for all its conquest of Asia's coastlines and islands, fought the Second World War in a state of perpetual scarcity. Steel was rationed. Rubber was irreplaceable once the Dutch East Indies fell silent under Allied blockade. Fuel was liquid gold, hoarded and allocated with the precision of a miser counting his last coins. Japanese tank crews trained on vehicles older than their fathers' service records. The Type 97 Chiha, Japan's most common medium tank, was designed in 1937 and entered service in 1938. By 1945, it was an antique facing an enemy whose factories produced new models like a river produces water endlessly, thoughtlessly, in quantities that defied comprehension. A Chiha weighed 15 tons. Its armor was 50mm at the thickest point, 25mm on the sides. Its main gun was a short-barreled 57mm cannon designed to fire high-explosive shells against infantry and fortifications, not to pierce the armor of enemy tanks. Its engine produced 170 horsepower. It could travel 210 kilometers on a full tank of gasoline. Gasoline that by 1945 was so scarce that Japanese armored units often marched into battle with half-empty fuel drums, knowing they had enough range to reach the enemy but not enough to withdraw. This was not a design flaw. This was philosophy. Japanese doctrine assumed that tanks would fight once, decisively, and that victory or death would follow. Retreat was not a variable that required fuel allocation. The men who crewed these machines understood their role. They were samurai in steel, expected to die in place, to sell their lives for time, to delay the inevitable with courage, if not firepower. And for 3.5 years, this philosophy had worked well enough. The British and Dutch colonial forces in Malaya and the East Indies had possessed few tanks and less will to fight. The Chinese armies were infantry-heavy, their anti-tank weapons outdated or not. But the Americans brought something different. They brought industry. When the first M4 Shermans arrived in the Pacific Theater in 1943, Japanese intelligence officers studied captured field manuals and wreckage with the intensity of archaeologists examining an alien civilization's artifacts. The Sherman weighed 30 tons, twice the mass of a Chiha. Its armor was 76 millimeters on the frontal hull, enough to shrug off the Japanese 57 millimeter shells at any range beyond point blank. Its main gun was a 75 millimeter M3, a weapon derived from French artillery designs of the First World War, but manufactured with American precision and American abundance of ammunition. A Sherman could carry 90 rounds, a Chiha carried 120 rounds. But this number was deceptive. Japanese tanks seldom received resupply once committed to combat. American tanks refilled their ammunition racks as casually as a civilian refilled a water glass. But the true horror, the detail that kept Japanese tank officers awake at night in their damp jungle bivouacs, was the engine. The Sherman's radial aircraft engine, a Wright R975 or a Chrysler Multibank, or in later models, a Ford Jaguar VOI2, produced 400 to 500 horsepower. It was cooled by fans and designed to run for thousands of hours between overhauls. It burned gasoline that arrived in the Pacific Theater in tankers the size of apartment buildings. Gasoline so plentiful that American logistics officers complained not about scarcity but about storage capacity. A Sherman could travel 190 kilometers on a full tank, but unlike the Chiha, it would be refueled again and again and again. For every Sherman destroyed, 2 more arrived. For every Japanese tank lost, there was silence, a gap in the line, a prayer that infantry could hold what armor could not. This disparity in material was understood bitterly by every Japanese officer who faced American armor, but understanding and witnessing are different things. Understanding is abstract. It lives in reports, in intelligence summaries, in the careful language of staff officers who have never seen a friend burn inside a steel box. Witnessing is immediate. It is sensory. It is the smell of your own tank's engine oil mixing with the copper tang of blood, the sound of an American shell punching through armor that was supposed to protect you, the sight of your gunner's body slumped over his sight, his hand still gripping the traverse wheel as if willpower alone could turn the turret faster. And witnessing American tanks cross rivers while firing, this was not merely a technological surprise, it was a theological crisis. The development of deep wading equipment for American tanks was not a sudden inspiration. It was the product of painful lessons learned in blood and salt water. On November 8, 1942, American forces launched Operation Torch, the invasion of French North Africa. Among the landing force were M4 Shermans equipped with rudimentary waterproofing sealing compounds on hatches, extended exhaust pipes, tarps over engine decks. The theory was sound. The execution was catastrophic. Tanks offloaded into surf that was calmer than expected still drowned when waves topped their engine decks. Others made it to shore only to have their electrical systems short out from saltwater intrusion. The 1st Armored Division lost dozens of tanks, not to German guns but to the Mediterranean Sea. The lessons were documented. The solutions were engineered. By 1943, American tank crews in the European theater were training with deep wading kits that included rubberized canvas air intakes, extending 6 feet above the turret, waterproofed electrical systems, and bilge pumps to evacuate water from the hull. These modifications allowed a Sherman to ford rivers up to 7 feet deep, far deeper than at standard wading depth of 3 feet. But fording was still fording. It required finding a crossing point where the bottom was solid, where the current was not too strong, where enemy observation was limited. It was slow. It was vulnerable. It was in the minds of aggressive American armored officers who had studied German blitzkrieg tactics and Soviet deep battle operations. Insufficiently audacious. The conceptual leap came not from engineers but from tankers, specifically from officers who had seen the limitations of river crossings in Italy, where every ford became a killing ground, where German 88mm guns turned riverbeds into graveyards. What if, these officers proposed, a tank did not merely survive a river crossing but fought during it? What if the turret remained above water and operational while the hull was submerged? What if the enemy, expecting the vulnerable pause of a ford, instead faced live fire from an enemy who refused to stop killing even when the technical requirements were significant but not insurmountable? Not for a nation whose industrial output exceeded the combined production of all Axis powers. The air intake had to be tall enough and sealed well enough to prevent water from flooding the engine even in current. The electrical system had to be waterproofed to a degree that seemed obsessive, until one remembered that a shorted battery in the middle of a river meant a dead tank and a drowned crew. The turret traverse had to remain functional, which meant sealing the turret ring against water intrusion, while maintaining the ability to rotate and elevate the gun smoothly. The gun itself had to be fired while the tank was in motion through unstable footing, which required gyrostabilizers, a technology that American tanks had pioneered and that no other nation had successfully implemented on a wide scale. The M4A3E8 Sherman, commonly called the Easy 8, became the platform for perfecting these techniques. It featured improved suspension, better armor protection, and the high-velocity 76mm gun that could penetrate most German armor at combat ranges. But its secret weapon was not visible in any schematic. It was training. American tank crews practiced deep wading in stateside rivers, in North Carolina swamps, in flooded quarries in Pennsylvania. They practiced until the panic of descending into brown water became routine. They practiced until the gunner could acquire a target while the driver fought current, until the loader could maintain ammunition flow while ankle-deep in bilge water, until the commander could navigate by periscope, when spray and mist reduced visibility to nothing. By the time these tanks reached the Philippines in late 1944, their crews had crossed more rivers in training than most Japanese tank units had seen in their entire service. This was not courage. This was not even skill, though skill was required. This was industrialized competence, the ability to perform the exceptional as if it were ordinary, to turn the theoretically possible into the tactically routine. Japanese doctrine had no answer for this. Japanese tank manuals included chapters on river crossing, but they were defensive in nature: how to position guns to cover a ford, how to prepare demolitions to destroy bridges, how to use rivers as barriers behind which infantry could rest and regroup. The concept of an attacking tank force using a river not as an obstacle to overcome but as a medium through which to maintain offensive momentum was absent. It was not that Japanese officers were unintelligent or unimaginative. It was that their entire material reality made such tactics unthinkable. When fuel is scarce, you do not practice river crossings that consume extra gasoline. When tanks are irreplaceable, you do not risk drowning them in training exercises. When ammunition is rationed, you do not expend shells learning to fire from unstable platforms in moving water. The Americans, drowning in oil and steel and bullets, practiced exactly these things. And when they arrived on the rivers of Luzon, they did not pause. They attacked the Agno River crossing on January 17, 1945. Was not the first time American tanks had fired while deep, but it was the first time Japanese defenders faced a tactic in a major engagement, and the first time their reports reached higher command with enough detail to convey the psychological impact. The American force was a battalion of the 754th Tank Battalion, attached to the 6th Infantry Division. Their objective was to break through Japanese defensive lines along the river and secure a bridgehead for follow-on forces advancing toward Manila. The standard doctrine would have called for infantry to secure the far bank, for engineers to construct a bridge, for tanks to cross in daylight under air cover. But the division commander was impatient and the weather was not cooperating. Low clouds grounded American aircraft. Japanese artillery had destroyed 2 engineer bridges the previous day. Every hour of delay allowed the enemy to strengthen their positions. The tank battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Ernest Miller, proposed an alternative. His Shermans would cross at a ford where the river was deep but the current manageable. They would wade in column, maintaining interval, with turrets traversed to cover the far bank. They would not wait for infantry. They would not wait for air support. They would cross under their own fire, suppressing enemy positions with high explosive shells and machine gun fire, and establish the bridgehead themselves. The plan was approved, with the sort of casual confidence that characterized American operations in the final year of the war, a confidence born not of arrogance but of experience, of having crossed 100 rivers before, of knowing that even if some tanks were lost, more tanks waited in reserve. The Japanese, intercepting radio traffic and observing the American preparations through artillery observers hidden in the hills, prepared their ambush. They positioned Type 97 tanks in revetments along the eastern bank, camouflaged with palm fronds and netting. They sighted anti-tank guns, obsolete 37mm pieces supplemented by a handful of newer 47mm weapons in positions with overlapping fields of fire across the river. They dug infantry trenches and connected them with communication tunnels. They laid mines in the shallows. They did everything their doctrine and their dwindling resources allowed, and they waited. The Shermans entered the water at 0620 hours, just after dawn. The lead tank, commanded by Sergeant Howard Bates of Missouri, descended the western bank with its engine roaring, the sound echoing off the water like thunder confined in a canyon. The deep wading intake stack jutted above the turret like the snorkel of a mechanical whale. Water reached the top of the tracks, then the hull, then the fenders. The driver, Corporal James Rucker, felt the current push against the tank's side, felt the ground beneath the tracks shift from gravel to mud to something softer. He corrected with the steering levers, fighting the river the way one fights a living thing, with respect and constant adjustment in the turret. Sergeant Bates spoke calmly into the intercom, his voice a lifeline in the dim, vibrating interior. Gunner, target, tree line, 2 o'clock, suspected gun position. The gunner, Private Leonard Wells, traversed the turret, the electric motor whining. Water sloshed against the turret ring but did not enter. The gun elevated 2 degrees. Wells peered through his telescopic sight, seeing only mist and shadows, then movement, a rectangular shape that did not belong. The angular lines of a camouflaged tank. Identified, Wells said. Bates did not hesitate. Fire. The Sherman fired while 40 feet from the western bank and descending into water that would soon cover the hull entirely. The recoil rocked the tank, making it yaw slightly in the current. The high explosive shell struck the Type 97's turret and detonated. The Japanese tank, its thin armor, no match for the American 76mm gun even at extended range, brewed up instantly. Flames erupted from its hatches. Black smoke poured into the gray morning sky. On the eastern bank, Lieutenant Colonel Takamura watched the American tank continue its descent into the river, its turret already traversing toward the next target, its machine guns opening fire on the tree line, red tracers arcing through the mist. Behind it, a second Sherman entered the water, then a third. They came in a column, each tank maintaining 50 meters interval, each turret alive and rotating, each gun firing. Takamura's radio operator was screaming into his handset, his voice cracking with a fear he could not control, reporting to headquarters that American tanks were crossing while engaging, that they were firing from the water, that they were not stopping. The headquarters officer, a major who had never seen combat, demanded clarification. Was the observer saying the Americans were firing from the water? That was impossible. Tanks could not fire while waiting. The observer must be mistaken. The radio operator looked at Takamura took the handset. "This is Takamura," he said, his voice flat, drained of emotion. "The observer is correct. The Americans are crossing and firing simultaneously. Recommend immediate withdrawal of all armor to secondary positions. Current defensive line is indefensible." There was a long pause. Then the major's voice, quieter now, uncertain. "Understood. Withdrawal authorized," but it was already too late. The Japanese Type 97 tanks, those that survived the initial barrage, attempted to maneuver out of their revetments and fall back to prepared positions 200 meters to the rear. But Japanese tanks were slow. Their engines, starved of quality fuel, coughed and hesitated. Their tracks, worn from years of inadequate maintenance, through treads, and the Americans, emerging from the river like steel gods shedding water, did not give them time. The Shermans fired on the move, using their gyro stabilizers to keep guns on target even as they climbed the muddy eastern bank. Their tracks tearing up the earth, their exhausts belching black smoke. They fired high explosive shells into the revetments, collapsing the log and earth structures onto the tanks within. They fired armor-piercing rounds into the thin side armor of retreating ships, punching through 15 millimeters of steel plate as if it were paper, the shells continuing through the fighting compartment and out the other side, leaving 2 neat holes and a crew that died without understanding why. The crossing took 14 minutes. The firefight lasted 30 by 0650 hours. The 754th Tank Battalion had established a secure bridgehead on the eastern bank. They had lost a tank Swan to a landmine in the shallows, one to a lucky shot from a 47mm anti-tank gun that struck the thinner belly armor as the Sherman climbed the bank. 7 men died, 19 were wounded. In exchange, they destroyed or captured 11 Japanese tanks for anti-tank guns and broke the back of an enemy defensive line that had been expected to hold for 3 days. The American tankers climbed out of their vehicles and vomited river water, adrenaline, and fear. They slapped each other on the back and smoked cigarettes with shaking hands. They did not speak much. There was nothing to say that the roar of engines and guns had not already articulated. They had done the impossible, because their country had given them the tools to do it and the training to survive it. They had crossed a river while killing, and the enemy had broken. Lieutenant Colonel Takamura did not witness the end of the battle. He withdrew with the remnants of his company, 5 tanks reduced to 2, and established a new defensive line in the hills. That night, he wrote in his journal by candlelight, his handwriting cramped and precise. "The Americans do not fight as we do," he wrote. "They do not ask their men to do the impossible with inadequate tools. They make the impossible possible, and then they do it as if it were routine. We expected them to respect the river. They did not. We expected them to pause, to be vulnerable, to give us the time we needed to kill them. They gave us nothing. They took everything. This is not a war we can win. This is not a war we were ever equipped to fight." 3 weeks later, during the battle for Manila, Takamura's tank was destroyed by a P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bomb. His body was found in the wreckage, his journal clutched in one burned hand. To understand what the Japanese commanders felt when they saw American tanks fire while crossing rivers, one must appreciate the symbolism embedded in that act. In Japanese military culture, the river was a natural aliyah barrier that separated the strong from the weak, the prepared from the reckless. Rivers rewarded patience and punished haste. They were defensive tools, natural fortifications that required no concrete or barbed wire. A commander who could position his forces behind a river had bought time, had imposed delay on his enemy, had created space for maneuver and regrouping. The Americans, with their deep-wading Shermans, annihilated this assumption. They transformed the river from a shield into a stage, a medium through which they demonstrated technological and doctrinal superiority so overwhelming that it bordered on the supernatural. To the Japanese soldier watching from a foxhole, watching tanks descend into water that should have drowned them, watching turrets remain above the surface like the heads of dragons, watching muzzle flashes and smoke and the death of his comrades, this was not merely a military defeat. It was a revelation. It was proof that the enemy operated under different physical laws, that their wealth and industry had given them the power to ignore constraints that Japanese forces accepted as immutable. The recurring symbol in Japanese after-action reports from river crossings as water itself, not as a barrier but as a substance that obeyed American will. One report from Luzon, dated February 3, 1945, describes American tanks crossing the Pampanga River and includes the line, "The enemy tanks moved through the water as if they had made a pact with it, as if the river had agreed to drown us but not them." This is not the language of a military officer writing a tactical assessment. This is the language of a man whose worldview has been shattered, who has been forced to confront the possibility that the universe itself favors his enemy. In Germany, the reaction was similar. When American tanks of the 9th Armored Division crossed the Rhine at Remagen in March 1945, capturing the Ludendorff Bridge before German engineers could destroy it, the psychological impact on German defenders was profound. But even before Remagen, American armor had been practicing deep-wading crossings on the Roe and Moselle rivers, using the same techniques developed in the Pacific. German defenders, accustomed to thinking of rivers as temporary respites, as places where the front line stabilized and the killing paused, found themselves under fire from tanks that emerged from the water like clockwork mechanisms, designed for a single purpose: to kill without stopping. A German tank commander, Hauptmann Friedrich Weber of the 9th Panzer Division, wrote in a letter to his wife, dated January 28, 1945, "We destroyed the bridges, we mined the fords, we positioned our guns to sweep the river, and still they came. Their tanks crossed in water deep enough to drown a man, and they fired at us while crossing. Greta, they have so much of everything: fuel, shells, tanks, men, that they do not pause for rivers, they do not pause for anything. We are fighting a nation that has turned war into an industrial process, and we are the raw material being consumed." Weber did not survive the war. His tank was destroyed by Sherman near Cologne in February, but his letter, recovered by American occupation forces and translated for intelligence purposes, circulated among U.S. Army analysts as evidence of German morale collapse. The analysts missed the deeper point. Weber was not merely commenting on American material superiority. He was articulating the psychological weight of facing an enemy who could afford to be reckless, because abundance had made recklessness safe. This was the paradox at the heart of American armored doctrine in the final year of the war. American tanks were not, on a technical level, superior to the best German or Soviet designs. The German Panther and Tiger tanks possessed better armor and more powerful guns. The Soviet T-34 85ths was more mobile and mechanically reliable in harsh conditions, but the Americans had more tanks, vastly more. The United States produced nearly 50,000 M4 Shermans during the war, more than Germany produced of all tank models combined. This quantitative superiority enabled a qualitative difference in doctrine. American commanders could afford to take risks that German or Japanese commanders could not. They could afford to cross rivers under fire, because losing a few tanks to drowning or enemy action was acceptable when replacements arrived within days. They could afford to train their crews in complex techniques like deep wading, because training time was abundant and training grounds were safe from enemy attack. The Japanese and Germans, fighting with one hand tied behind their backs by fuel shortages and production bottlenecks, could afford none of this. Their tank crews learned to fight in combat, or they died without learning. Their tanks crossed rivers at night, slowly, or not at all, and when they faced an enemy who crossed in daylight, guns blazing, water streaming from their hulls, they understood viscerally what their intelligence officers had been telling them for years. This war was already lost. The only question was how long it would take for the losing to become official. But there is another layer to this story. One less about technology and more about the men who operated the machines. The American tank crews who performed these river crossings were not supermen. They were farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit and college dropouts from California. They were draftees and volunteers, 18-year-olds who had never left their home states before the war, and 30-year-olds who had left behind wives and children. They were terrified. Private First Class Leonard Wells, the gunner who fired the first shot during the Agno River crossing, gave an interview to an Army historian in 1946. In it, he described the experience of descending into the water, of watching the river rise up the viewport until he could see nothing but brown murk, of hearing the engine roar and the water slap against the hull and the commander's voice on the intercom saying, "Target, target, target," as if they were on a firing range in Kentucky instead of in a river in the Philippines with Japanese guns waiting to kill them. "I thought we were going to die," Wells said. "Not from the Japs, from drowning. I kept thinking, what if the engine floods? What if the seals fail? What if we hit a hole and the water comes over the turret?" And Sergeant Bates just kept talking, calm as anything, telling me where to aim, telling the loader to have the next round ready, telling the driver to keep steady. And I realized he was more scared of letting us down than of dying. He was scared we'd panic, so he pretended he wasn't scared, and we all pretended with him. And we crossed that river and we killed the enemy and we didn't die. But I think about it sometimes, how close it was, how easy it would have been to just sink and nobody back home would have known the difference. Just another tank lost in the Philippines. This fear, the fear of drowning, of being trapped inside a steel coffin as water poured in through seals that failed, as the engine coughed and died, as the lights went out and the air turned to liquid, was universal among American tank crews who performed deep wading operations. The training helped. The equipment helped, but in the end, what carried them across was trust. Trust in the engineers who had designed the waterproofing. Trust in the mechanics who had installed it. Trust in the commander who ordered them into the water. Trust in each other. The Japanese did not have this trust because they did not have the foundation on which it was built. When a Japanese tank crew looked at their vehicle, they saw a machine held together by improvisation and prayer. They saw welds that had cracked and been re-welded with substandard rods. They saw bolts that should have been steel but were iron because steel was reserved for ships. They saw fuel tanks half empty and ammunition racks that would not be refilled. They saw, in short, a nation losing a war, and they understood that no amount of courage could change that. The Americans looked at their Shermans and saw something different. They saw a machine built by the strongest industrial economy in human history. They saw welds that would hold because the welder had been trained for 6 months in a factory in Michigan. They saw bolts that met specifications because specifications were enforced by inspectors who rejected parts that did not pass muster. They saw fuel trucks waiting behind the lines, and ammunition depots so large they required railroads to supply them. They saw, in short, abundance. And abundance breeds a certain kind of confidence. A willingness to attempt the difficult because failure is survivable, and success is rewarded. This confidence was visible in the small details of American operations. Sergeants who carried extra rations in their tanks not because they expected to starve but because they might get hungry. Crews who painted nicknames on their turrets, Big Bastard, Hell on Wheels, Mama's Boy, with the understanding that the tank would survive long enough for the name to matter. Commanders who planned operations, assuming air support and artillery support and resupply because those things were reliable, not miraculous. The Japanese planned operations assuming nothing. They assumed air superiority belonged to the enemy. They assumed artillery would be limited and ammunition scarce. They assumed resupply would not arrive. They assumed, in other words, that they were alone. And in that loneliness, in that knowledge that every shell fired was one less shell for tomorrow, in that understanding that every tank lost was irreplaceable, they fought with desperation and courage and a kind of fatalism that Americans mistook for fanaticism but was actually something more tragic, the bravery of men who know they are dying for a cause that has already lost. The transformation in Japanese perception of American capabilities did not happen all at once. It was cumulative, a slow, crushing realization built from 100 encounters, 1,000 small defeats, the daily evidence that the enemy was not merely stronger but operated in a different reality. The river crossings were one piece of this mosaic. The daylight bombing raids by hundreds of B-29s were another. The casual destruction of Japanese positions by naval gunfire from battleships that fired shells heavier than a man was yet another. Each encounter reinforced the central truth. America was so wealthy, so industrially powerful, that it could afford to fight a war on the other side of the planet, with a logistical tail so long and so robust that frontline troops lived better than Japanese officers. There is a story, probably apocryphal but repeated in enough sources to suggest a kernel of truth, about a Japanese patrol on Luzon that ambushed an American supply convoy in early 19. Patrol destroyed 2 trucks and was preparing to scavenge the wreckage when American reinforcements arrived and drove them off. Later, under cover of darkness, the Japanese returned to the site. What they found astonished them. The trucks had been carrying rations, not ammunition, not fuel, not medical supplies, but food. The Japanese soldiers opened crates and found canned meat, canned fruit, chocolate bars, cigarettes, coffee. They found white bread wrapped in wax paper, soft and fresh. They found butter, real butter, not the rancid substitutes Japanese troops had been eating for 3 years. They filled their packs and retreated into the jungle, and that night they ate better than they had eaten since the war began. One soldier, according to the account recorded in a post-war interview, began to cry while eating a chocolate bar. His squadmates asked why. He said, "Because a nation that can ship chocolate to its soldiers fighting on the other side of the world is a nation we cannot defeat. We are starving, and they are eating candy. How do we fight that?" This story, whether factually accurate or not, captures the emotional reality of the Japanese soldiers' encounter with American abundance. The Sherman tank firing while crossing a river was the military technical expression of the same principle. It said, "We have so much fuel that we can practice river crossings until they become routine. We have so many tanks that losing a few to drowning is acceptable. We have so much ammunition that we can fire while maneuvering through unstable terrain. We have so much of everything that we do not pause. We do not hesitate. We do not stop." For Japanese commanders trained in a doctrine that valorized sacrifice and efficiency, that treated scarcity as a virtue and abundance as a moral weakness, this was incomprehensible. How could a nation that wasted resources on chocolate bars and cigarettes and tanks that fired while swimming also be winning the war? The answer, which some Japanese officers grasped and others refused to accept, was that abundance was not waste. Abundance was strategy. It allowed for redundancy, for training, for experimentation, for the kind of combined arms coordination that required time and resources to perfect. It allowed American forces to make mistakes and learn from them, to lose battles and still win campaigns. to absorb casualties that would have shattered a Japanese division and still advance the next day. The symbolic object that recurs in Japanese accounts of American river crossings is not the tank itself but the water streaming from the hull as it climbed the far bank that should have drowned the machine, but instead merely ran off it like rain off a roof. This image appears in reports, in journals, in post-war memoirs. It becomes a metaphor for American invincibility, for a nation that could not be drowned, could not be stopped, could not be defeated by any obstacle that Japanese forces could place in its path. A Japanese officer, Major Kenji Hat, wrote in his diary after witnessing an American river crossing on the Kogajan River in northern Luzon. The water fell from their tanks like the Amaterosu's blessing falls from the unworthy. We are the unworthy. We have angered the gods by challenging a nation that the gods favor. Why else would the rivers part for them? Why else would the steel float and the guns fire and our shells bounce away like pebbles thrown at a temple gate? I do not fear death. I fear that I will die without understanding why we were doomed from the beginning. Hatano survived the war. He became a schoolteacher in Osaka and never spoke publicly about his wartime service. But his diary, donated to a university archive by his daughter after his death in 1983, it provides a window into the psychological state of Japanese officers in the final months of the war, a mixture of fatalism, incomprehension, and a bitter awareness that courage and discipline could not compensate for material inferiority. On the scale they faced, the broader strategic consequences of American deep-wading capabilities were significant but difficult to quantify. Rivers that should have delayed American advances by days or weeks were crossed in hours. Defensive lines that Japanese and German commanders had expected to hold long enough to allow retreat or reinforcement collapsed before they could be fully manned. The tempo of American operations accelerated, not because American soldiers were braver or more skilled than their enemies, but because American logistics and engineering had removed obstacles that other armies considered insurmountable. In the Philippines, the advance from the Lingayen Gulf to Manila, a distance of roughly 120 miles across terrain crisscrossed by rivers and swamps, that was expected by Japanese planners to take at least 6 weeks. It took less than 3. The speed of the American advance was due in part to air superiority and naval gunfire support, but a significant factor was the ability of American armor to maintain momentum across water obstacles. Every river that was crossed without pausing for bridge construction was a day or two gained. Was a Japanese defensive position outflanked? Was a supply depot captured before it could be evacuated? In Germany, the story was similar. The Ruhr River crossings in February 1945, which German commanders had hoped would delay the Allied advance long enough to allow a withdrawal to the Rhine, were accomplished in a fraction of the expected time. American armored divisions crossed at multiple points simultaneously, their tanks wading through icy water while firing at German positions on the far bank, establishing bridgeheads faster than German reserves could respond. The subsequent advance to the Rhine, and the seizure of the Ludendorff Bridge at Rimac, shortened the war in Europe by weeks, possibly months, and saved thousands of lives, both Allied and German, that would have been lost in prolonged fighting. But these strategic outcomes, measurable in miles advanced and days saved, do not fully capture the psychological dimension of American deep-wading operations. The Japanese soldier who watched a Sherman emerge from the Agno River, water cascading from its hull, its gun traversing toward him, did not think about strategic tempo or operational planning. He thought about death. He thought about the impossibility of stopping an enemy who seemed to control not just the air and the sea but the rivers themselves. He thought about the futility of resistance when every natural barrier became merely another medium through which the Americans attacked. This psychological impact compounded over time. Each river crossing, each demonstration of American capability, eroded Japanese morale a little further. And morale, in the final analysis, was all the Japanese had left. Their tanks were obsolete. Their supply lines were shattered. Their air force was a memory. What remained was the willingness of individual soldiers to fight and die in place, to delay the inevitable with their bodies if not their weapons. But willingness is not infinite. It requires hope, even if that hope is only for a meaningful death, for a sacrifice that serves a purpose. When the enemy crosses rivers while firing, when the enemy does not pause, when the enemy's advance seems as unstoppable as a flood, hope dies, and with it, the will to resist. By March 1945, Japanese defensive doctrine in the Philippines had devolved into a strategy of dispersal and ambush. Large-scale armored engagements were abandoned. Tanks were hidden in caves and used as stationary pillars. River lines were not defended. They were abandoned before the Americans arrived. The goal was no longer to stop the enemy but to make them pay for every mile, to kill as many as possible before being killed in turn. This was not a strategy for victory. It was a strategy for revenge, for ensuring that even in defeat, the cost would be high. But even this grim calculus failed. American casualties in the Philippines campaign were lower than expected precisely because American forces did not pause at the obstacles that were supposed to bleed them. They crossed rivers. They bypassed They used mobility and firepower to avoid the grinding attritional battles that Japanese planners had hoped to impose. The Americans, in short, refused to fight the war the Japanese wanted them to fight, and the Japanese, lacking the resources to impose their will, they could do nothing but watch and die. There is a final story, one that brings together the technological, tactical, and psychological threads of this narrative. It takes place on April 3, 1945, near the town of San Fernando in northern Luzon. The Japanese 105th Division, reduced to fewer than 3,000 effectives, had established a defensive line along the Abra River. They had no tanks left. They had 3 anti-tank guns, all of them obsolete 37mm pieces with ammunition so old the propellant charges had degraded. They had infantry armed with rifles and grenades and a handful of magnetic mines that were supposed to be attached to enemy tanks by soldiers willing to die in the attempt. They had orders to hold for 7 days. They held for 9 hours. The American force that attacked them was the 32nd Infantry Division, supported by a company of M4A3E8 Shermans from the 754th Tank Battalion, the same unit that had crossed the Agno River in January. The Shermans approached the river at midday, in full view of the Japanese defenders. There was no attempt at stealth, no preliminary bombardment to suppress enemy fire. The tanks simply drove to the water's edge, adjusted their deep wading stacks, and entered the river in column. The Japanese anti-tank guns opened fire immediately. The range was less than 400 meters, close enough that even obsolete guns should have been effective. But the shells struck the frontal armor of the Shermans and bounced off, leaving scars but no pen. The Japanese gunners reloaded frantically, knowing they had seconds before the American tanks returned fire. They got off 2 more rounds each before the Shermans' turrets rotated toward them and the world became fire and noise. The Japanese infantry, watching the anti-tank guns disintegrate under American fire, watching the tanks continue their advance into the river without slowing, began to break. Not all at once, not in a panic, but individuals, then squads, then entire platoons, stood up from their foxholes and ran. Some ran toward the rear, seeking safety that did not exist. Others ran forward, toward the river, toward the tanks, with grenades in their hands and the intention of dying in a way that might matter. They were shot down by American infantry advancing behind the tanks, cut down by machine gun fire before they got within throwing distance. The Shermans crossed the Abra River in 11 minutes. They established a bridgehead. Infantry followed. By nightfall, the American line had advanced 3 miles beyond the river. The Japanese 105th Division ceased to exist as a cohesive fighting force. Survivors fled into the mountains, where they would spend the remaining months of the war scavenging for food and hiding from American patrols. The commanding officer, Colonel Matsuru Nagano, committed suicide 2 days later. His last message to headquarters, transmitted by a radio man who deserted immediately afterward, read, "We cannot stop them. We have nothing that can stop them. The river did not stop them. Courage did not stop them. Even death does not stop them. Because when we kill 1, 2 more come. I am sorry we failed." This message, intercepted and translated by American intelligence, was filed in a report and forgotten. It was not exceptional. By April 1945, messages like it were arriving from every sector of every front where Japanese forces faced American armor. The content was always the same. We cannot stop them. We have tried everything. We have nothing left. But beneath the military language, beneath the formal admission of tactical failure, there is something else, a note of existential bewilderment, a sense that the Japanese officer is not merely reporting a defeat, but wrestling with a philosophical problem he cannot solve. How does one fight an enemy for whom the impossible is routine? How does one resist a nation that treats rivers as minor inconveniences, that fires its guns while swimming, that replaces its losses faster than they can be inflicted? The answer, which many Japanese officers reached independently and which none wanted to articulate, was that one does not. One dies. And in dying, one hopes to preserve some measure of honor, some sense that the sacrifice meant something even if it changed nothing. After the war, American military analysts studied the deep wading operations and codified the lessons learned. The techniques that had been developed through trial and error in the rivers of Italy and the Philippines became standard doctrine. Future tanks to M26 Pershing, the M46 Patton, the M48 and M60 series were designed from the outset with deep wading capabilities. The U.S. Army established training centers where crews practiced river crossings under simulated combat conditions. The knowledge gained from those terrified 19-year-olds driving Shermans into brown water while Japanese guns tried to kill them became institutional, was written into field manuals, was taught to new generations of tankers who would never know. The names of the men who had figured it out first. The Japanese, rebuilding their nation from the ashes of defeat, drew different lessons. The post-war Japan Self-Defense Force, prohibited by constitution from possessing offensive military capabilities, focused on defensive strategies and technologies. When they did acquire armored vehicles, they were designed for the defense of the Japanese home islands, short range, heavily armored, optimized for fighting from prepared positions. The idea of crossing rivers while under fire, of using mobility as a weapon, was absent. It belonged to a different philosophy, one that required abundance and industrial depth that Japan no longer possessed and no longer aspired to possess. But in the memoirs and diaries of Japanese veterans, the image of American tanks crossing rivers remained. It became a symbol not of defeat, though it was certainly that, but of the vast gulf between two nations' ways of war. The Japanese had fought with what they called Yamato Damashi, the spirit of Japan, a concept that emphasized willpower and sacrifice and endurance in the face of material inferiority. The Americans had fought with assembly lines and logistics networks and an engineering mindset that treated problems as solvable given sufficient resources. Both approaches had their virtues, but only one had won. In 1952, a Japanese veteran named Takeshi Yamamoto published a memoir titled Water and Steel. Yamamoto had been a tank driver in the Philippines and had survived the war by the narrowest of margins. His tank destroyed in the final weeks of fighting, his crew dead, his own body scarred by burns. In the memoir, he described the moment he first saw an American Sherman cross a river while firing. "I understood then," he wrote, "that we were not fighting men. We were fighting a system that could take an ordinary American boy, give him a tank that cost more than my village's annual rice production, train him for a year in safety and comfort, and then send him across the ocean to kill me. And if he died, the system would send another boy, in another tank, and another, until there were no more of us to kill. We called this cruelty, but it was not cruelty, it was efficiency, and we had no answer for it." Yamamoto's memoir was not widely read. The post-war Japanese public was not interested in rehashing military defeats, but among historians and military professionals it became a reference point, a clear-eyed assessment of why Japan lost the Pacific War. Written by someone who had experienced that loss at the most visceral level, Yamamoto did not blame Japanese courage or Japanese tactics. He blamed the decision to go to war with a nation whose industrial capacity exceeded Japan's by an order of magnitude, whose population was 3 times larger, whose natural resources were effectively unlimited. "We thought," Yamamoto wrote, "that spirit could overcome matter. We were wrong. Matter crushed spirit, and the tanks crossing the rivers were the proof." The epilogue to this story is not found in archives or memoirs but in the rivers themselves. The Agno River still flows through Luzon, carrying its brown water from the mountains to the sea. The Abra River still cuts through the valleys of northern Luzon, its current still strong enough to challenge a man trying to wade across. The Roe River in Germany still marks the landscape, a silver thread winding through farmland that was once a battlefield. These rivers remember nothing. They are indifferent to history, to the tanks that crossed them, to the men who died in their waters or on their banks. But the lesson remains, inscribed not in water but in doctrine, in the institutional memory of militaries that study the past to prepare for the future. The lesson is simple and profound. In war, the side that can afford to do the impossible will do it, and the side that cannot afford even the possible will lose. The American Sherman tank, firing while crossing a river in 1945, was not a weapon. It was a statement. It said, "We have so much that we can waste it on audacity. We have so much that we can train for years to perfect a technique you cannot even attempt. We have so much that losing is survivable and winning is inevitable." This was not arrogance. It was mathematics. It was the cold calculus of industrial war, where the nation with the deepest reserves and the longest production lines and the most fuel and steel and bullets will prevail, not because its soldiers are braver but because its factories never sleep. The Japanese commanders who watched those tanks emerge from the water, guns blazing, understood this. They understood it viscerally, in their bones, in the way one understands an oncoming train when standing on the tracks. They could not articulate it in the moment. There was no time for philosophy while shells were landing, but later, in the quiet after surrender, in the years of reconstruction and reflection, they found the words. And the words all pointed to the same truth. They had fought a nation for whom abundance was a weapon more devastating than any bomb, more decisive than any battle. They had fought a nation that crossed rivers because it could, and they had lost because they could not. And so the rivers flow, indifferent, eternal, carrying their water from the mountains to the sea, past the places where men once fought and died and learned that in the end, the greatest advantage in war is not courage or skill or even technology. It is having enough fuel to practice, enough tanks to replace losses, enough food to feed your soldiers chocolate, enough of everything that the impossible becomes ordinary, that rivers become roads, that the enemy despairs not, because you are invincible but because you are inexhaustible. This is the legacy of the Sherman tank firing while crossing the Agno River on January 17, 1945, is a legacy of industrial power made manifest, of abundance weaponized, of an enemy stunned into submission not by a single decisive blow but by the relentless accumulation of small impossibilities, day after day, river after river, until the only rational response was surrender. And in that moment, in the spray and the roar and the smoke, the war was already over. The rest was just mathematics.